Have you ever been blindsided by betrayal? The kind that shatters everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you? If you've been there, or if you've ever wondered how you'd react, this story is for you. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you love jaw-dropping stories of betrayal, revenge, and unexpected twists, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Today's story is one of heartbreak, fury, and ultimate redemption. Meet David, a hardworking husband and father who dedicated his life to his family. He thought he had built a solid foundation with his wife, Rachel, until one fateful moment tore it all apart. It started with a phone call, a simple act that unraveled years of deception. David, overwhelmed with suspicion, dialed the hotel where Rachel had claimed to be on a business trip. What he uncovered on that call shattered his world. The truth? Rachel wasn't alone. She was with someone else, someone who had no idea what was coming. But this isn't just a story about betrayal, it's about revenge. David didn't just sit back and accept his fate. He fought back with a plan so meticulous, it left Rachel and her affair partner reeling. He used their lies against them, exposing their secrets in a way they never saw coming. Stay tuned, because as we unfold this story, you'll see how David turned his pain into power, and how his ultimate revenge left everyone speechless. Ready? Let's dive in. David sat in his dimly lit living room, his fingers gripping the edges of his phone. His mind replayed the past few months, the unexplained late nights, the sudden work trips, the evasive answers when he asked Rachel where she'd been. He had tried to ignore the gnawing doubts, brushing them off as paranoia. But tonight something felt different. Rachel had told him she was attending a company retreat at a downtown hotel. It wasn't unusual for her to have such events, but this time her story didn't add up. A slip in her tone, a hesitation in her response when he asked which hotel. David couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He stared at the hotel's phone number on the screen. His thumb hovered over the call button, his heart pounding. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm right? He took a deep breath and pressed dial. Good evening, Hilton Grant. How may I assist you? The receptionist's voice was polite, professional. David's throat tightened. I'm trying to reach a guest. Rachel Peterson. Could you connect me to her room? There was a pause, then the faint clicking of a keyboard. One moment, sir. David's chest felt like it was caving in as he waited. He prayed for a simple answer. She's not here. You must have the wrong hotel. But when the receptionist returned, her words made his stomach drop. Room 1123. I'll connect you now. The line clicked and then it began to ring. David's hand tightened around the phone, his knuckles white. The bitterness in his throat rose as he thought about what he might hear on the other end. The ringing stopped. Hello? A man's voice answered, groggy and annoyed. David's blood ran cold. It wasn't Rachel. Who is this? He demanded, his voice low but trembling with restrained fury. This is Don, the man replied, his tone sharp now. Who's asking? Put Rachel on the phone, David said, his voice icy. The man hesitated for a moment. Then there was muffled movement in the background, the rustling of sheets, hushed whispers. David's stomach churned as his suspicions solidified into an unbearable reality. Finally, Rachel's voice came on the line. Yes, she said casually, almost bored, as though she were answering a telemarketer. David clenched his jaw. When you're done entertaining your boyfriend, maybe you'd like to explain to your husband why you're not at a business retreat. There was silence. David could hear Rachel's breathing on the other end, uneven now, caught in the lie. You're overreacting, she said finally, her voice tinged with irritation. We'll talk when I get home. No, David snapped. We'll talk now. But first, maybe you'd like to explain why Ethan is lying unconscious in the hospital while you're out having fun. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. What happened to Ethan? Rachel asked, her tone sharper now. Come to the hospital and find out, David spat, slamming the phone down before she could respond. He sat there, his hands trembling, the room spinning around him. The weight of betrayal pressed down on him, mingling with the fear and anguish he felt for his son. It wasn't just the affair that broke him, it was Rachel's timing, her sheer indifference to their family's pain. Ethan, their 10-year-old son, had been rushed to the hospital earlier that evening after being hit by a car while riding his bike. David had spent hours by his bedside, praying for him to wake up. And where was Rachel? Wrapped up in another man's arms. As David paced the hospital waiting room, he replayed the phone call over and over in his mind. The sound of Don's voice, the casual tone Rachel had taken when she answered, each detail cut deeper, solidifying his resolve. Rachel arrived an hour later, her face calm and composed as if nothing had happened. She wore the same red dress she'd left the house in earlier that day, her hair and makeup flawless. "What happened to Ethan?" she asked, barely glancing at their son's hospital room. David stood, his fists clenched. "What happened?" he hissed, keeping his voice low to avoid disturbing Ethan. "While you were busy with your affair partner, our son was hit by a car. That's what happened." Rachel flinched but quickly recovered. "I wasn't with anyone," she said defensively. "You're making a big deal out of nothing." David laughed bitterly. "I called your room, Rachel. I spoke to him. Don't insult my intelligence." For a moment, guilt flickered across her face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "Fine," she said, crossing her arms. "Yes, I was with Dawn. But don't act like you're some saint, David. This marriage has been dead for years." Her words hit him like a slap. "Years?" he repeated, incredulous. "You've been lying to me for years?" "This isn't just my fault," Rachel shot back. "You've been distant, working late, always distracted. Dawn makes me feel alive, something you haven't done in years." David stared at her, speechless. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was her utter lack of remorse. He turned and walked into Ethan's room without another word, vowing to focus on what truly mattered, his son. But deep inside, the fire of revenge began to burn. David and Rachel's story started like many others. A whirlwind romance, a picture-perfect wedding, and dreams of a shared future. They had met 15 years ago at a friend's housewarming party. Rachel, with her vibrant smile and quick wit, had captivated David instantly. She had a way of lighting up any room she walked into, and David, with his steady and reliable demeanor, seemed like the perfect balance to her fiery energy. Their early years were full of promise. David worked tirelessly to grow his career as an architect, spending long hours designing buildings that would one day stand as testaments to his hard work. Rachel, a marketing consultant, loved the flexibility her job offered, often juggling clients and projects with ease. They laughed a lot in those days, sharing late-night talks about their future, their goals, and their plans to start a family. When their son Ethan was born, everything seemed to fall into place. David took on more work, determined to provide the best for his family, while Rachel shifted her focus to part-time work to be there for their son. They were a team, or so David thought. Over the years, life's demands began to take their toll. David found himself buried in work, chasing deadlines and promotions. He wanted Rachel and Ethan to have everything: a beautiful home, financial security, and the freedom to enjoy life. But the long hours at the office left him drained. By the time he got home, he often had little energy left for anything else. Rachel, meanwhile, began to change. At first, David chalked it up to the stress of parenting and managing work, but the changes became harder to ignore. She grew distant, her warm smiles turning into distracted nods. Conversations between them felt more like formalities than real connections. When David tried to bridge the gap, Rachel would brush him off, claiming she was tired or had too much on her mind. The subtle red flags started to pile up. Rachel's phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter, now seemed glued to her side. She'd tilt the screen away when David walked by or take her calls in another room. Her once sporadic work trips became more frequent, and she grew increasingly vague about her schedule. "Where are you headed this time?" David asked one evening as Rachel packed a suitcase. "Oh, just a conference downtown," she replied, not looking up. "For 3 days?" he probed, trying to mask his growing unease. "Clients want FaceTime," she said with a shrug, zipping her bag shut. David wanted to push further, but he stopped himself. Accusing her outright felt irrational. "What if I'm wrong?" he thought. He didn't want to be the paranoid husband. But deep down, David knew something was wrong. He replayed the moments when Rachel seemed overly defensive, her casual dismissal of his concerns, and the way she avoided intimacy. Once, he had suggested they go on a weekend getaway, just the two of them, to rekindle their connection. She had laughed it off, saying, "Who has time for that? Besides, don't you have work?" David's sacrifices for their marriage only seemed to widen the growing chasm between them. He worked tirelessly to provide for their family, taking on projects he didn't enjoy and enduring the pressures of a demanding career. Vacations were planned around Rachel and Ethan's schedules, leaving David to tie up loose ends at work before he could join them. He didn't mind, he wanted them to be happy. But somewhere along the way he realized he was no longer part of that equation. Their nights together became increasingly rare. Rachel would stay up late scrolling through her phone or watching TV in another room, leaving David to fall asleep alone. On the rare occasions when they did talk, it felt strained, as if they were two people playing roles in a script they'd forgotten how to love. The disconnection weighed heavily on David, but he told himself it was temporary. "We're just busy," he'd reason. "Things will get better." But they didn't. The laughter that once filled their home had been replaced by silence. Even Ethan, perceptive as children often are, had started to notice. "Why doesn't Mom eat dinner with us anymore?" he asked one evening as David set the table. "She's busy, buddy," David replied, forcing a smile. Rachel's excuses began to blur together. Work trips, late meetings, girls' nights, each explanation felt rehearsed. David didn't want to believe she was capable of betrayal, but the evidence was mounting. He had spent years turning a blind eye, convincing himself that their struggles were just a phase. But the truth was unavoidable. Rachel had already checked out of their marriage, long before he made that fateful phone call to the hotel. Looking back, David realized he had been fighting for something Rachel no longer valued. Every late-night work session, every missed family dinner, every effort to provide the life he thought they wanted, it had all been for nothing. The woman he had married, the woman he had loved unconditionally, had been slipping away, and he hadn't seen it until it was too late. As David paced the hospital waiting room, the weight of it all came crashing down. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the years of sacrifice, the memories they had built, and the promises they had made. Rachel hadn't just cheated on him, she had torn apart the foundation of their family. And now, standing at the edge of this unraveling life, David knew he couldn't let her destroy what little remained. It was time to stop fighting for a marriage that no longer existed and start fighting for himself. And for Ethan. David sat in his car outside the hospital, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The conversation with Rachel replayed in his mind, each word like a dagger twisting deeper into his chest. She hadn't just betrayed him, she'd done it with a dismissiveness that made his sacrifices feel meaningless. But as much as the pain threatened to overwhelm him, another emotion began to surface: rage. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. Rachel's choices had endangered their family, left their son without a mother at his bedside, and dismantled years of trust. David wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. He took a deep breath, his jaw tightening with resolve. It was time to stop feeling sorry for himself and start acting. That evening, after making sure Ethan was settled in his hospital room, David called Mike, his younger brother and closest confidant. Mike was the kind of person who could always keep a level head in a crisis, and David needed that now more than ever. "She's been cheating on me," David said bluntly as soon as Mike answered. The silence on the other end was deafening before Mike finally spoke. "Are you sure?" "I called her hotel room," David replied, his voice shaking. "Some guy answered. She didn't even bother denying it." Mike cursed under his breath. "I'm so sorry, man. What are you going to do?" David exhaled slowly. "I don't know yet, but I can't let her get away with this. Ethan deserves better." "Damn right he does," Mike said. "Look, I've got a lawyer friend, Richard Lawson. He's sharp, no nonsense, and he'll make sure you and Ethan are protected. Want me to set up a meeting?" "Do it," David said without hesitation. The next morning, David met with Richard in a sleek downtown office. The lawyer, a calm and composed man in his early 40s, listened intently as David laid out the situation. "First things first," Richard said, flipping open a legal pad. "We need to gather evidence. The phone call is a good start, but we'll need more. Texts, emails, financial records. Anything that shows a pattern of neglect or misconduct." David nodded, a newfound determination building within him. "What about custody?" "If you can prove she's unfit, you'll have a strong case," Richard replied. "But we'll need to tread carefully. Judges don't like messy cases and Rachel will fight back." "Let her," David said coldly. "I'm done protecting her." As David began piecing together the fragments of Rachel's betrayal, the picture grew darker. He went through their shared bank accounts and found several unexplained withdrawals over the past 6 months. Thousands of dollars funneled to an account he didn't recognize. He scoured her emails and stumbled upon a few flirtatious messages exchanged with someone named Don. It didn't take long to connect the dots. But what truly stunned David was a voicemail he found on their home phone's answering machine. "Hey Rachel, it's Don. Just wanted to check in. I know things got crazy with your kid in the hospital, but I'm here if you need me. Call me when you can, babe." David's blood boiled as he replayed the message, the casual tone of Don's voice igniting a fury he hadn't known he was capable of. But the voicemail also raised questions. What was Rachel telling him? How deep did this go? The answers came faster than David expected. With Mike's help, he accessed a list of recent transactions tied to Rachel's mysterious account. To his shock, he discovered she had been transferring money not just to Don, but to an offshore account under her name. "What the hell is she doing?" David muttered as he stared at the screen. "Looks like she's hiding something big," Mike said over the phone. "This isn't just an affair. This is fraud." David's mind raced. Rachel wasn't just betraying him emotionally, she was siphoning their family's resources for her own gain. And if she thought she could get away with it, she was wrong. Over the next few days, David worked with Richard to build his case. Every late-night phone call, every transaction, every missed dinner or work trip Rachel had used as a cover, all of it was documented. Richard's network of private investigators uncovered even more. Rachel had been using her job as a cover to meet Don in various hotels, and their activities weren't limited to infidelity. Don was leveraging Rachel's access to David's finances for his own failing business ventures. "Don's business is a sinking ship," Richard explained during one meeting. "He's in debt up to his neck and Rachel's been funding him using your money. If we play this right, we can expose everything." David clenched his fists. "Do it. I don't care what it takes." The stage was set for David's revenge. While Rachel and Don continued their charade, oblivious to the storm brewing around them, David prepared his next move. He knew that direct confrontation wasn't enough. He needed to dismantle their lives as methodically as they had dismantled his trust. It started with freezing the shared accounts, leaving Rachel scrambling for cash. Then, David filed for full custody of Ethan, citing Rachel's neglect and financial misconduct. Rachel didn't take it well. She stormed into their home one evening, her face flushed with anger. "What the hell are you doing?" she demanded, throwing a stack of papers onto the table. David looked up calmly. "Protecting our son. This isn't about Ethan," Rachel snapped. "This is about you trying to control me." "No," David replied, his voice cold. "This is about you betraying your family. And now you're going to face the consequences." As Rachel stormed out, David felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The pieces were falling into place and for the first time in months he felt in control. The battle wasn't over, but David was ready for it. The man Rachel had underestimated was about to show her just how wrong she had been. Don Sanders sat in his modest office at a struggling car dealership, nursing a stale cup of coffee. The financial strain of keeping the business afloat weighed heavily on him, but you wouldn't know it from his cocky demeanor. Don prided himself on his ability to charm anyone, customers, colleagues, and most importantly, Rachel. Meeting Rachel had been a stroke of luck, he thought. She was beautiful, sharp, and clearly unhappy in her marriage. Don saw her dissatisfaction as an opportunity. To him, David was just another boring husband who didn't know how to appreciate what he had. Rachel, on the other hand, was a spark of energy in Don's otherwise dull life. What had started as harmless flirting during a chance meeting at a networking event quickly escalated into an affair. Don saw Rachel as more than just a conquest. She was a means to an end. Her access to David's finances and her willingness to support Don's business ventures made her invaluable. Rachel, meanwhile, told herself the affair wasn't entirely her fault. For years she had felt invisible in her own home. David's long hours at work and his constant focus on providing left her feeling like an afterthought. She had tried to talk to him, but their conversations always ended the same way, with David promising things would get better, only for nothing to change. Don made her feel alive again. With him, Rachel felt seen and desired in a way she hadn't for years. She justified her actions by convincing herself that she deserved happiness, even if it came at the cost of her marriage. "It's not like David is innocent," she told herself one evening as she texted Don. "He chose work over me. He checked out of this marriage long before I did." Rachel's desires weren't just about excitement, they were about control. She had spent so long living in David's carefully constructed world that she wanted something of her own, even if it meant breaking the rules. The secret trips, the whispered phone calls, the thrill of sneaking around, all of it gave her a sense of independence she hadn't felt in years. But Rachel wasn't blind to the risks. She knew David would be furious if he found out, but she didn't think he would do anything drastic. He was predictable, steady, and in her eyes too cautious to truly retaliate. Besides, Rachel believed she had Don to back her up. Don, however, was less confident than he appeared. Behind the swagger was a man drowning in debt, desperately clinging to Rachel's financial support to keep his business afloat. He assured her that their investments would pay off soon, but the truth was far less promising. Don knew he was living on borrowed time, but he believed he could outsmart any consequences. "She's got money," Don thought, scrolling through texts from Rachel. "And if her husband gets in the way, we'll handle it." What's the worst he can do? Rachel, too, underestimated David. She saw him as passive, a man too focused on maintaining peace to truly confront her. That assumption gave her the confidence to continue her affair without looking over her shoulder. But cracks were beginning to show. Dawn noticed Rachel growing more anxious as David started asking questions. And Rachel couldn't ignore the financial strain David's recent actions were causing. The frozen accounts and legal filings weren't just inconveniences, they were warnings. Still, Rachel clung to the belief that she could control the situation. David's just bluffing, she told Dawn during a late-night phone call. He's trying to scare me. He won't actually do anything. Even if he does, I've got your back, Dawn replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Neither of them realized how wrong they were. Rachel and Dawn's overconfidence blinded them to the storm David was quietly building. They didn't see the subtle shifts in his demeanor or the steps he was taking to uncover their secrets. To them, David was still the same man they had dismissed as predictable and unthreatening. But the impending consequences were closer than they thought. The evidence David had gathered, the lawyer he had hired, and the financial irregularities he had exposed were all converging into a tidal wave that neither Rachel nor Dawn could escape. And while they reveled in their false sense of security, David was preparing to deliver the blow that would shatter their lives. David sat in his lawyer Richard's office, the faint hum of traffic outside barely registering as they reviewed the final pieces of their strategy. Every detail of Rachel's betrayal and Dawn's complicity had been meticulously documented. Bank records, texts, emails, and even Dawn's voicemail, it was all there. This wasn't just about a divorce, it was about dismantling the lives of two people who had taken everything David held dear and treated it like a game. Are you ready? Richard asked, his tone calm but firm. David nodded, his resolve unshaken. Let's do this. The first step was swift and decisive. David and Richard filed an emergency motion to freeze all joint accounts, citing Rachel's financial misconduct. Rachel discovered the freeze a few days later when she tried to withdraw money to cover one of Dawn's failing business ventures. David's phone buzzed that evening, Rachel's name lighting up the screen. He let it go to voicemail. When he finally listened to the message, her voice was a mix of anger and panic. David, what the hell is going on? The accounts are frozen. How am I supposed to pay for anything? Call me back. David smiled grimly. This was just the beginning. Next came the public unmasking. Using Richard's network of private investigators, David leaked just enough evidence to a trusted journalist to spark an investigation into Dawn's business practices. Articles began circulating online, detailing financial irregularities and questionable dealings at Dawn's dealership. The headlines hit Rachel and Dawn like a tidal wave. Local business owner faces fraud allegations, was splashed across social media and news sites, dragging Dawn's reputation through the mud. At the same time, anonymous tips about Rachel's affair began making their way into her workplace. Whispers spread among her colleagues and her professional image, once pristine, was now tainted by scandal. Rachel stormed into the house one evening, her face flushed with fury. "What have you done, David?" she demanded. David looked up from his laptop, his expression calm. "I haven't done anything. But it seems like your choices are finally catching up with you." Her eyes narrowed. "You think you're so clever, don't you? This isn't over." "You're right," David said, standing up. "It's not. But it will be soon." The day of the court hearing arrived, and Rachel sat across from David in the courtroom, her lawyer whispering furiously in her ear. Richard laid out the case with precision, presenting the financial evidence that painted Rachel as negligent and deceitful. But the bombshell came when Dawn was called as a surprise witness. As Dawn took the stand, his usual arrogance had been replaced by nervousness. Under Richard's questioning, he admitted to accepting money from Rachel for his failing business and even acknowledged the offshore account she had set up in her name. Rachel's face went pale as Dawn revealed more than she expected. "She told me it was her savings," he said, avoiding her furious glare. Richard didn't miss the opportunity. "So, to be clear, you knowingly accepted funds from a married woman, fully aware that those funds might not have been solely hers?" Dawn hesitated before muttering, "Yes." The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Richard turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this testimony, combined with the financial evidence, clearly demonstrates gross misconduct by Mrs. Peterson, not only as a spouse but as a parent. We request full custody of Ethan be granted to Mr. Peterson, along with restitution for the misappropriated funds." The judge's gaze was stern as he addressed Rachel's lawyer. "Does your client wish to respond?" Rachel's lawyer fumbled for words but ultimately had little to offer in her defense. The weight of the evidence was too overwhelming. The judge's ruling was swift. David was granted full custody of Ethan, with Rachel allowed only supervised visitation until she completed court-mandated counseling. Additionally, Rachel was ordered to pay restitution for the misused funds, and the offshore account was frozen. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing, Rachel sat motionless, her face a mask of disbelief. Don avoided her gaze, clearly realizing their partnership had crumbled under the weight of their lies. David walked out of the courtroom feeling a sense of relief he hadn't felt in months. Justice had been served, and the two people who had tried to destroy his life were finally facing the consequences. With the legal battle behind him, David turned his attention to rebuilding his life. He poured his energy into creating a stable and loving environment for Ethan, ensuring his son felt safe and supported through the transition. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching Ethan's favorite movie, David's phone buzzed. It was a message from Richard. "You did it? Congrats, David. Enjoy this new chapter." David smiled, setting the phone aside. This wasn't just a victory in court, it was a victory for himself and Ethan. Meanwhile, Rachel's life unraveled further. Unable to pay restitution, she was forced to sell her car and move into a small apartment. Her once flawless reputation was in shambles, and Don, desperate to save himself, cut all ties with her. Don's business eventually folded under the weight of the fraud investigation, leaving him bankrupt and alone. The experience changed David. No longer the passive man Rachel had taken for granted, he had emerged stronger, more confident, and determined to prioritize his and Ethan's happiness. One day, as he stood in their backyard watching Ethan play, David felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The betrayal had been painful, but it had also been a catalyst, a push to reclaim his life and focus on what truly mattered. Rachel and Don had underestimated him, and they had paid the price. David wasn't the man they thought they could manipulate anymore. He was someone who had found strength in adversity and turned his pain into a story of resilience and redemption. Rachel sat in the dimly lit diner where she worked the night shift, her uniform stained with coffee and grease. The soft hum of conversation around her did little to drown out her thoughts. She had once lived a life of comfort, surrounded by luxury and security, but now she was barely scraping by. The fallout from David's revenge had left her humiliated, financially ruined, and isolated. Don, the man she had gambled everything on, had abandoned her. His business had collapsed under the weight of the fraud investigation, and he had cut ties with Rachel to save himself. She was left to face the consequences of their choices alone. Every night, as she wiped tables and served customers, she replayed the decisions that had brought her here. The thrill of the affair, the promises of a better life, all of it had turned to ash. David's silence in the weeks following the court battle was the loudest message. She had called, texted, even written a letter apologizing, but he never responded. The realization that she had lost not only her marriage but also the respect of her son was a burden she carried every day. Don, too, faced the consequences of his arrogance and greed. Bankrupt and disgraced, he lived in a small rental house on the outskirts of town, far from the flashy lifestyle he once flaunted. His name had become synonymous with failure in local business circles, and he struggled to find work. The man who once saw himself as untouchable was now reduced to a shadow of his former self. David, on the other hand, was thriving. The storm Rachel and Don had unleashed on his life had become the catalyst for a profound transformation. With Ethan by his side, David focused on rebuilding their home into a place of love and stability. He reduced his work hours, prioritizing time with his son over late nights at the office. The experience had taught him the value of resilience and the importance of emotional presence. Ethan, once quiet and withdrawn, began to open up, finding joy in the small moments they shared, whether it was playing catch in the backyard or cooking pancakes together on Saturday mornings. David also turned his pain into purpose. Inspired by his journey, he partnered with a local organization to mentor men and women who had faced betrayal or financial abuse, helping them regain their confidence and rebuild their lives. His story resonated with many, and he found fulfillment in using his experience to make a difference. One afternoon, as David watched Ethan ride his bike down their quiet street, he reflected on how far they had come. Betrayal had shattered his world, but it had also forced him to rebuild it stronger than before. He had learned to let go of the past, to prioritize what truly mattered, and to embrace the future with hope. The moral of David's journey was clear. Pain is inevitable, but how we respond to it defines who we are. David chose to rise above the hurt, turning his heartbreak into an opportunity for growth and empowerment. And there you have it, David's incredible journey from heartbreak to redemption. A story of betrayal, revenge, and ultimately transformation. What would you have done in David's situation? Would you have fought back the way he did or taken a different path? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters. This story is a reminder that life's most painful moments can lead to profound growth. David could have let the betrayal consume him, but instead he used it as fuel to create a better life for himself and his son. It's a lesson for all of us. No matter how dark the situation may seem, there is always a way forward. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of resilience, karma, and justice, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We share powerful stories that inspire, shock, and remind us of the strength within us all. And before you go, here's a question to ponder. Have you ever faced betrayal? How did you handle it and what did you learn from the experience? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and remember, even in the face of betrayal, you have the power to rise above and rebuild. See you in the next story.